December 1944, Western Front. Early morning. The forest is quiet in a way that feels unnatural. Snow clings to shattered branches and broken wire, muffling sound but not tension. Somewhere beyond the tree line, artillery has fallen silent, not because the battle is over, but because both sides are waiting to see who moves first. A German officer lowers his binoculars slowly. Across the open ground, American soldiers remain where they are, dug in, exposed, exhausted. The bombardment that should have scattered them has ended, yet they have not withdrawn. They have not collapsed into confusion. No white flags, no panicked movement, just stillness. Hours earlier, German guns had torn through their positions with precision, the kind of fire meant to break morale as much as bodies. In past campaigns, it usually worked. Men ran, lines folded, resistance thinned. But this time, the Americans stayed. Now, as dawn lifts the fog, German observers report the same unsettling detail from multiple sectors. The enemy is still there. Units are reforming. Weapons are coming back online. Medics move calmly between foxholes. Radios crackle. Orders are passed. The officer writes a short note in his logbook. It is not dramatic. It does not sound alarmist. But it captures something new. These soldiers were supposed to break. They did not. And in that realization, quiet, undeniable, German confidence begins to shift into something colder and far more dangerous. By the time German officers began encountering American units that refused to break under fire, the war in Europe had already entered a new phase. The conflict they were fighting in 1944 was not the same war they had dominated in 1939 or 1940. The tempo had changed, the balance had shifted, and the assumptions forged during years of early victory were no longer reliable. German military doctrine had long emphasized shock and momentum. Artillery preparation, combined arms assault, and rapid exploitation were designed to overwhelm an enemy's ability to respond. In earlier campaigns, this approach had produced dramatic results. Polish and French units collapsed under pressure. Soviet formations disintegrated in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. Even British forces, though resilient, often withdrew when faced with concentrated firepower. These experiences shaped German expectations. When American forces entered large-scale ground combat in Europe, many German officers initially believed they would behave similarly. U.S. soldiers were viewed as inexperienced, overly dependent on equipment, and psychologically fragile. German intelligence reports prior to Normandy frequently described American troops as brave but soft, men who would fight hard at first, but whose morale would falter under sustained pressure. This belief was reinforced by early encounters. In North Africa, American units had suffered setbacks during their first engagements with seasoned German formations. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces exploited tactical errors and inexperience, inflicting significant losses. For many German officers, this battle confirmed their assumptions. The Americans, they believed, lacked the hardness required for prolonged combat against veteran troops. But what Kasserine did not reveal was how quickly the American army learned. Following those early defeats, U.S. forces reorganized aggressively. Command structures were streamlined, training intensified. Units were rotated, reinforced, and retrained, with an emphasis on combined arms coordination and battlefield resilience. Lessons were absorbed not over years, but over months. By the time American troops landed in Normandy in June 1944, they were no longer the army that had stumbled in Tunisia. German commanders along the Atlantic Wall expected confusion once the landings began. They expected shock to ripple through the enemy's ranks. They expected artillery and machine gun fire to shatter morale, forcing withdrawals and buying time for counterattacks. What they encountered instead was something unfamiliar. American units absorbed punishment and continued moving. When attacks stalled, soldiers regrouped rather than retreating. Losses were heavy, but cohesion remained. Even under fire that would have broken earlier adversaries, American formations reorganized, adapted, and resumed pressure. German officers began noting this pattern with increasing concern. Reports from Normandy described American infantry advancing methodically, supported by artillery and armor that responded quickly to requests. When pinned down, units did not dissolve. They called for fire. When positions were lost, counterattacks followed swiftly. When individuals fell, replacements appeared with unsettling speed. This resilience was not accidental. American doctrine placed enormous emphasis on support.
Soldiers were trained to expect artillery, air power, and logistical backing. They fought with the understanding that they were not isolated, even when conditions suggested otherwise. Radios linked squads to batteries miles away. Supply lines delivered ammunition, food, and medical aid in quantities that German units increasingly struggled to match. For German officers accustomed to enemies who fought until overwhelmed and then collapsed, this behavior was disorienting. The Americans did not seek heroic stands. They sought continuity. They bent, but they did not break. And as these encounters multiplied across hedgerows, villages, and forested ridgelines, German commanders began to realize that they were facing an opponent whose strength was not rooted in fanaticism or desperation, but in endurance. That realization would deepen as the fighting moved inland and the pressure on German defenses intensified. As the summer of 1944 wore on, German officers across the Western Front began to compare notes. What they were seeing was not confined to Normandy, nor was it limited to elite American units. The same pattern appeared in Brittany, around Caen, in the hedgerows south of St. Lo, and later along the approaches to Paris. American soldiers endured pressure differently. German doctrine relied heavily on the belief that sustained fire would fracture cohesion. Artillery barrages were designed not merely to kill, but disorient, to sever command links, overwhelm nerves, and create openings that maneuver units could exploit. This method had worked repeatedly in earlier phases of the war, especially against opponents whose logistics and communications were less robust. Against American formations, its effects were blunted. Shellfire inflicted casualties, but it did not produce the cascading breakdown German officers expected. Platoons that lost leaders did not dissolve. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers assumed control with minimal hesitation. Communications were restored quickly. Units that had been pinned down resumed movement once fire shifted or support arrived. This behavior unsettled German field commanders. In reports and after-action summaries, they began to note that American units appeared unusually confident in their ability to endure punishment. That confidence was rooted in expectation. U.S. soldiers believed, correctly, that artillery, armor, or air support would arrive when called. They trusted that wounded would be evacuated. They trusted that ammunition shortages would be temporary. They trusted that relief would come. German soldiers increasingly could not say the same. By late 1944, German formations were often understrength, undersupplied, and short of experienced leadership. Replacement troops arrived with limited training. Ammunition shortages forced commanders to ration fire. Fuel scarcity restricted mobility. Medical evacuation became uncertain as Allied air power dominated roads and rail lines. Under these conditions, German units could not afford prolonged engagements. American units could. This imbalance shapes the psychology of combat on both sides. German officers found themselves calculating not just tactical possibilities, but endurance thresholds. They asked how long they could hold a position before supplies ran out, before losses became irreplaceable, before morale cracked. American officers asked different questions. They asked how to apply pressure steadily, how to rotate units without losing momentum, how to exploit the enemy's inability to recover. This contrast became especially evident during defensive engagements. German units would launch carefully prepared attacks, often supported by artillery and armor. Initial gains were sometimes made. Positions were penetrated. Casualties were inflicted. But when the expected collapse did not follow, momentum stalled. American units held ground stubbornly, absorbed the blow, and counterattacked with fresh forces. German officers began describing these encounters with a new vocabulary. The Americans were tenacious. They were methodical. They were difficult to dislodge. Not reckless, not fanatical. Relentless. This resilience was reinforced by American command philosophy. Orders emphasized maintaining contact, preserving unit integrity, and continuing pressure even after setbacks. Retreats were tightly controlled. Withdrawal was permitted, but collapse was not. Soldiers were trained to expect chaos and continue functioning within it. German commanders, increasingly stretched thin, recognized the implications. They were no longer facing an opponent whose morale could be shattered by shock alone. They were facing one whose strength lay in continuity, an army designed to keep functioning even when individual parts were damaged. As the front expanded and Allied advances accelerated, this difference grew more pronounced. American units rotated through the line. Rested soldiers replaced exhausted ones. Equipment was repaired or replaced. The cycle repeated without pause. German units remained in place until they could no longer hold. By autumn, many German officers privately acknowledged that American infantry resilience had become a defining factor of the campaign. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself loudly. But it eroded German options steadily, day by day, engagement by engagement. The question facing German leadership was no longer whether American soldiers would break. It was how long German units could endure against an enemy that would not. That question would be answered in the battles that followed, where endurance, rather than shock, would decide the outcome.
The human factor. Discipline under fire. For German officers on the ground, The most unsettling aspect of American resistance was not how fiercely U.S. soldiers attacked, but how calmly they endured. In earlier campaigns, German commanders had relied on the psychological effect of firepower. Sustained artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire were meant to do more than inflict casualties. They were intended to create panic. Men would press themselves into the ground. Orders would go unheard. Units would fragment. Against American soldiers, that sequence often failed to materialize. Under fire, American infantry did not rush forward recklessly, nor did they flee. They stayed low. They waited. They followed procedure. When shelling lifted, movement resumed with a methodical precision that German officers found increasingly difficult to disrupt. This discipline was not the product of fanaticism, it was the result of training and expectation. American soldiers were taught that incoming fire, however terrifying, was a condition to be endured rather than a signal to withdraw. They trusted that survival depended on coordination, not impulse. German observers noted that even newly arrived American units displayed this behavior. Loss of veteran personnel did not result in collapse. Replacement soldiers filled gaps and continued fighting with minimal disruption. The line bent, but it held. Tactical reality. Why shock no longer worked. German battlefield tactics depended heavily on timing. A preparatory barrage would soften defenses. An assault would follow quickly, exploiting confusion before the enemy could reorganize. Against American units, this window closed rapidly. U.S. forces reacted to bombardment with pre-planned responses. Units displaced temporarily returned to positions once fire shifted. Communications were restored quickly through redundant systems. Artillery observers resumed contact and called for counterfire with speed that surprised German commanders. What had once been a decisive advantage became a diminishing return. German officers reported that American defenses recovered faster than expected. Positions believed neutralized resumed firing. Assaulting troops encountered resistance that should not have existed. Counterattacks arrived sooner and with greater coordination. This forced German units into prolonged engagements they could not sustain. American doctrine favored pressure rather than breakthrough. Firepower was applied incrementally. Ground was taken slowly, but it stayed taken. When German attacks stalled, American units exploited the pause, pushing forward under covering fire. The battlefield rhythm shifted. Shock lost its effectiveness. Endurance gained value. Leadership at the smallest level. One of the clearest differences German officers observed lay in American small unit leadership. U.S. infantry relied heavily on non-commissioned officers. Squad leaders and platoon sergeants exercised significant authority. When officers were killed or wounded, command did not vanish. It transferred downward seamlessly. German units, increasingly short of experienced leaders, struggled to replicate this flexibility. American soldiers appeared accustomed to operating under fragmented conditions. Orders were simple, objectives were clear. Initiative at the lowest level was encouraged. German intelligence reports noted that American squads continued functioning even when isolated, maintaining cohesion until contact was restored. This decentralized resilience made American units difficult to disrupt. Killing a commander did not paralyze the unit. Destroying a position did not dissolve resistance. The system absorbed losses and continued forward. For German officers trained in a more centralized command structure, this adaptability was deeply frustrating. The enemy's realization, not fragile, just different. By late 1944, German commanders stopped describing American soldiers as inexperienced or soft. They described them as dependable. This shift was subtle but significant. It reflected a growing respect for an enemy whose strength was not rooted in individual heroics, but in collective stability. American soldiers fought as part of a system that valued consistency over spectacle. German officers recognized that this made the Americans difficult to intimidate. Fire that would have shattered morale elsewhere produced only temporary disruption. Losses that might have broken another army resulted in reinforcement and renewed pressure. The Americans did not seek decisive moments, they sought sustained advantage. This understanding reshaped German defensive planning, but too late to reverse the trend. American soldiers had demonstrated something German commanders could no longer ignore. They could be hurt, they could be delayed, but they could not be broken by fire alone. That realization would reach its full weight during the battles where German forces made their last major attempts to shatter Allied lines through shock and surprise. Technology is psychological armor. German officers understood technology in terms of firepower, guns, armor, and explosives. What they came to recognize in American units was something subtler, technology as reassurance. The enemy's psychology, when intimidation failed. German doctrine relied heavily on intimidation. Shock action was meant to overwhelm the enemy's nerve, the sound of artillery, the sudden appearance of armor, the pressure of rapid assault. Against American troops, intimidation produced diminishing returns. German officers reported that repeated exposure to fire hardened rather than weakened American resolve. Soldiers who survived bombardment emerged cautious, not panicked. They adjusted behavior rather than retreating from it.
Fear existed, but it did not control decision-making. This was deeply unsettling for German commanders. They had relied on fear as a weapon. Now they faced an enemy who acknowledged fear but refused to let it dictate action. American soldiers did not seek to prove bravery. They sought to survive and continue the mission. American soldiers fought knowing that support was never abstract. Radios worked. Artillery answered. Medical evacuation arrived. Ammunition resupply followed predictable schedules. Even under heavy fire, soldiers trusted that systems behind them remained intact. This confidence mattered. When German artillery struck American positions, it inflicted damage but rarely isolation. Forward observers survived long enough to call counter-battery fire. Engineers repaired lines. Vehicles arrived through shell fire to deliver supplies. The battlefield never went quiet long enough for despair to settle in. German officers noted that American soldiers behaved as if time was on their side, because it was. Moral contrast. Fighting with a future. Perhaps the most profound difference German officers observed was moral rather than tactical. American soldiers fought with a sense of continuity. Even in brutal engagements, they expected rest, rotation, and eventual relief. Wounded men expected treatment. Survivors expected reinforcement. The war, however hard, pointed toward an end that favored them. German soldiers increasingly lacked this perspective. By late 1944, many German units fought without certainty of replacement or recovery. Losses felt permanent, supplies felt finite, retreats felt irreversible. Under these conditions, morale eroded not through cowardice, but through exhaustion. German officers understood that morale was no longer symmetrical. American units endured because they believed endurance mattered. The strategic meaning of unbreakable units. At the operational level, German leadership recognized what these battlefield observations meant. An army that does not break under fire forces the enemy into prolonged struggle. Prolonged struggle favors the side with greater resources, deeper logistics, and broader manpower reserves. American resilience made German strategy unsustainable. Shock tactics failed. Breakthrough attempts stalled. Counterattacks bled strength without decisive results. Every engagement drained German capacity faster than it drained American momentum. German officers increasingly described American units not as opponents to be shattered, but as forces to be delayed. That shift marked the quiet collapse of German offensive doctrine in the West. The realization spread slowly, then all at once. American soldiers had changed the nature of the fight. They had turned battle from moments into processes. And in that transformation, German officers began to understand that the war could no longer be decided by force alone, but by endurance, time, and systems they no longer controlled. That understanding would collide with reality in the battles where Germany had made their last major attempts to break Allied lines by surprise and concentrated power. December 1944, the Ardennes forest. Snow muffled sound, fog choked visibility. The terrain favored surprise. For German officers, it was the last landscape that still felt familiar, a place where shock, secrecy, and concentrated force might still work. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Operation Walked Under Rhine, the Ardennes offensive, was built on a single premise, that American soldiers, isolated and untested in winter force fighting, would break under sudden pressure. German units would punch through thinly held lines, seize bridges, and fracture Allied cohesion before reserves could respond.
For the first hours, it seemed possible. American outposts were hit hard. Communications failed in places. Roads clogged with refugees and retreating units. Snowstorms grounded aircraft. German armor emerged from the mist where it was least expected. But something critical did not happen. American soldiers did not collapse. In towns like Bastogne, St. Vith, and along nameless forest roads, small American units absorbed blows that should have shattered them. Cut off, surrounded, low on ammunition and food, yet they held. German officers watched this with growing disbelief. They had planned for panic. They encountered resistance. At Bastogne, the situation crystallized everything German commanders feared. The town was encircled, roads were cut, supplies dwindled, artillery fire rained down relentlessly. German envoys approached under white flags, confident that the defenders would recognize the hopelessness of their position. The response, brief, defiant, unambiguous, was not bravado. It was a statement of reality. The Americans were not waiting for rescue because they expected defeat. They were holding because they expected reinforcement, and they were right. Across the Ardennes, German assaults met the same problem again and again. American units fell back when necessary, but they did not dissolve. Command structures survived disruption. Junior officers assumed control when seniors were killed or cut off. Communications were restored piece by piece. Defensive lines reformed behind every withdrawal. German shock tactics lost momentum within days. Fuel shortages slowed armor. Supply columns lagged behind advancing spearheads. American artillery, once reconnected, turned roads into killing zones. And when the skies finally cleared, Allied aircraft returned with devastating effect. German officers realized too late that surprise alone was no longer enough. The Americans had learned how to absorb shock without surrendering initiative. The psychological turning point came not when the German advance stopped, but when it failed to induce fear. Captured American soldiers showed exhaustion, not despair. Units continued to counterattack locally, even while surrounded. Requests for surrender were met with delay tactics rather than capitulation. German commanders noted something unprecedented. American soldiers seemed to believe that being cut off was temporary by default. That belief changed everything. By late December, the offensive stalled. What had been intended as a decisive blow became a grinding attritional fight, exactly the kind Germany could no longer afford.
Losses mounted, fuel ran dry, reinforcements arrived too slowly. The front stabilized, then bent back against the attackers. For German officers, the conclusion was unavoidable. If even the Ardennes, Germany's last carefully prepared shock offensive, could not break American soldiers under ideal conditions, then no remaining operation would. The moment of decision had passed, and as the initiative slipped away for the final time, the meaning of American resilience became unmistakable. The war would no longer be decided by who struck first, but by who could endure longest. That realization would be sealed in the final unraveling of German resistance as the Allies pushed inexorably toward the Rhine. Late December 1944 into early January 1945, the Ardennes no longer felt like an opportunity, it felt like a trap. German formations that had surged forward days earlier now found themselves stalled on narrow roads, burning fuel they could not replace, fighting an enemy that refused to unravel. The offensive had not failed in a single dramatic moment. It was bleeding out, hour by hour, position by position, and German officers knew it. Reports from the front began to change in tone. Where earlier messages spoke of breakthroughs in momentum, new dispatches focused on shortages, delays, and resistance that could not be explained away as temporary. American units were no longer merely holding, they were counterattacking with growing coordination. Most disturbing of all, they were doing so with confidence. At Bastogne, the siege broke. As weather cleared, Allied air power returned in force. Transport aircraft dropped supplies directly into the perimeter. Fighter bombers tore apart German positions, ringing the town. Artillery observers adjusted fire with devastating accuracy. When American armor finally punched through the encirclement, the message was unmistakable. The surrounded force had not been saved at the last moment. It had held exactly as long as intended. For German commanders watching the relief unfold, this marked the psychological collapse of the offensive. The Americans had not merely endured isolation, they had used it as a weapon, fixing German units in place while reserves assembled elsewhere. Shock had failed, endurance had won. Across the front, similar patterns emerged. German spearheads that advanced fastest now found themselves the most exposed. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks that had survived combat. Infantry units dug in defensively, waiting for orders that never came, or that arrived too late to matter. American forces, by contrast, grew stronger with each passing day. Fresh divisions rotated into the line. Artillery concentrations increased, communications stabilized. The battlefield rhythm shifted decisively. German officers no longer dictated tempo, they reacted to it. This reversal struck at the core of German operational doctrine. For years, German success had depended on breaking enemy cohesion before material superiority could be brought to bear. In the Ardennes, the opposite had occurred. American cohesion held long enough for material superiority to become decisive. There would be no recovery from that inversion. German commanders began to understand something deeply unsettling. American soldiers did not require ideal conditions to fight effectively. They adapted to chaos. They absorbed losses without losing organizational integrity. They trusted that higher command and overwhelming resources would eventually assert themselves. This trust was not abstract. It was reinforced daily by trucks arriving with ammunition, by artillery batteries reappearing after displacement, by aircraft filling the sky once weather permitted. Even when cut off, American units behaved as though relief was inevitable, because history had taught them that it was. German officers recognized the contrast painfully. Their own formations waited for fuel that never arrived. Orders depended on approvals delayed by collapsing command structures. Replacements were scarce. Air support was nearly absent. Every loss was permanent. The asymmetry was no longer tactical, it was existential. By early January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had fully stalled. American counteroffensives pressed from north and south, compressing the bulge that German forces had caused at such cost. Villages retaken days earlier fell again. Roads once seized in surprise were abandoned under pressure. German units withdrew under constant artillery fire and air attack. What began as a bold gamble ended as a fighting retreat. For senior German officers, the conclusion was final. If American soldiers would not break when isolated, surrounded, and attacked under winter conditions, then there was no scenario left in which Germany could force a decisive outcome in the West. The war was no longer a contest of plans, it was a countdown. In the months that followed, this realization shaped German decision-making across the collapsing front. There were no more grand offensives, only delays. No expectations of victory, only calculations of time. German resistance continued, but without illusion. American units crossed the Rhine not against a shattered enemy, but against one that understood resistance was futile and fought on regardless. That distinction mattered. It marked the difference between collapse and defeat. For German officers who survived the war, reflections on American soldiers returned again and again to the same point. They had expected improvisation to fail under pressure. Instead, it hardened. They had expected discipline to crack. Instead, it decentralized and endured. They had expected fear. Instead, they encountered resolve anchored in resistance, leadership, and an unshakable belief that time favored the United States. By the time German resistance finally ended in 1945, the lesson was beyond dispute. American soldiers did not need to win every moment. They only needed to outlast. And once that truth became clear, the outcome of the war was no longer in question. The long road from the Ardennes would now carry Allied armies into the heart of Germany itself, where the final consequences of that realization would unfold. The aftermath of the Ardennes was not defined by celebration, it was defined by certainty. By mid-January 1945, the battlefield that had once promised Germany a last reversal had become a confirmation of defeat. The bulge was erased, the front realigned, and the strategic balance, already tilted heavily toward the Allies, hardened into something irreversible. For the German High Command, the implications were devastating. The Ardennes offensive had consumed Germany's final mobile reserves in the West, panzer divisions that could not be replaced, fuel stocks that no longer existed, experienced officers and veteran NCOs lost in conditions that yielded no lasting gain. What remained was a defensive shell stretched thin across a collapsing front. The American army emerged from the battle changed, not exhausted, not shaken, proven. Units that had endured isolation, encirclement, and sustained pressure now carried with them a confidence that reshaped Allied planning. The belief that American formations could absorb shock and hold an hunt under the worst conditions was no longer theoretical, it was documented. This confidence accelerated Allied decision-making. Where caution might once have prevailed, momentum now dictated action. Commanders pressed forward knowing their formations would not unravel under pressure. Logistics planners expanded supply lines with the assumption that frontline units could hold long enough for resupply to arrive. The American army had demonstrated strategic reliability, and reliability wins wars. German officers recognized the shift immediately. Interrogations, after-action reports, and post-war testimony reveal a consistent theme. The Ardennes marked the moment when belief in an American breaking point vanished entirely. The enemy could be delayed, he could be wounded, but he could not be shaken loose. This realization stripped German fighting of its last aggressive logic. No future operation could rely on surprise alone. No temporary advantage could offset Allied endurance. The calculus that had once allowed Germany to fight outnumbered, speed, shock, and psychological collapse, no longer applied.
The Americans had absorbed those tools and neutralized them. Material consequences followed rapidly. With German reserves expended, Allied forces encountered diminishing resistance as they advanced toward the Rhine. Defensive lines existed, but they lacked depth. Counterattacks occurred, but without coordination or sustainment. German units fought hard locally, but could no longer influence outcomes operationally. American artillery and air power now operated without meaningful interruption. Bridges were crossed under fire, cities were encircled rather than assaulted head-on. German attempts to regroup were detected and dismantled before they could solidify. The battlefield rhythm belonged entirely to the Allies. For German soldiers, the psychological toll was profound. The Ardennes had been framed as a final chance, a decisive blow that might restore initiative. Its failure did more than cost lives and equipment. It erased belief. Morale did not collapse overnight, it thinned. Letters home reflected resignation rather than defiance. Officers spoke of survival rather than victory. Orders emphasized delay rather than counterattack. The language of command shifted from possibility to inevitability. Resistance continued, hope did not. The American advance that followed was methodical and relentless. River crossings were prepared with overwhelming force. Infantry units advanced behind artillery curtains measured not in shells, but in tonnage. Armor moved with infantry protection refined by months of combat. Communications networks functioned even under fire. The system worked, and German officers watching it unfold understood the final irony. The American soldier they had once dismissed as inexperienced had become the embodiment of modern warfare, disciplined without rigidity, aggressive without recklessness, resilient without fanaticism. This was not an army driven by desperation, it was an army designed to endure. The Ardennes did not decide the war alone, but it answered the last unanswered question. Could American soldiers be broken before American industry, logistics, and air power overwhelmed the battlefield? The answer, written in frozen forests and ruined villages, was no. And with that answer settled, the path forward led only one way, toward the Rhine, toward Germany, and toward an ending no counteroffensive could prevent. That realization would now shape the final phase of the war in the West. By February 1945, the war in the West no longer revolved around initiative, it revolved around time. For Germany, time had become the enemy. The failure to break American forces in the Ardennes stripped the Wehrmacht of its final operational flexibility. What remained was a sequence of withdrawals conducted under constant pressure, measured not in kilometers gained, but in days delayed. Each delay cost more than it bought. American forces advanced with a confidence shaped by survival. The experience of holding ground under the most punishing conditions of winter combat altered how units perceived risk. Where hesitation might once have slowed movement, commanders now understood that their formations could absorb shock without disintegrating. This allowed Allied planners to synchronize advances across a wide front, reducing pauses and denying German units the opportunity to regroup. The effect was cumulative. German positions were not smashed in single dramatic blows, they were compressed, bypassed, and rendered irrelevant by momentum. German officers noted this change with growing alarm. In post-war interviews and captured reports, many described a shift in American conduct after the Ardennes. Attacks were more deliberate, defensive reactions were faster, units recovered from losses without visible hesitation. There was no sense of overextension, only pressure applied steadily, relentlessly. The Americans were no longer learning, they were executing. The collapse of German command effectiveness followed closely. Communications suffered under constant air attack. Fuel shortages immobilized formations before contact. Replacement units arrived too late, too few, and too inexperienced to alter outcomes. Orders issued from higher headquarters often reached units after circumstances had already changed. Decisions lagged by reality. American forces exploited this gap. Crossings of the Ruhr and later the Rhine were conducted with overwhelming preparation. Artillery fire suppressed resistance before it could concentrate. Air superiority ensured that any attempted counter-movement was identified and destroyed in transit. German commanders found themselves reacting to completed actions rather than shaping events. The initiative was gone.
For German soldiers on the ground, the change was unmistakable. American units advanced without the frantic urgency of earlier campaigns. They paused only long enough to bring forward artillery, engineers, and supplies. Strong points were isolated rather than assaulted. Towns were encircled and starved of tactical relevance. The message was implicit. Resistance was acknowledged, but no longer feared. The psychological impact deepened as the front approached the German border. Defending foreign soil had once offered ideological justification. Defending the Reich itself strengthened hardened resolve. Instead, the opposite occurred. Units understood that even home ground could not compensate for material imbalance. The enemy they faced did not rely on desperation or last-minute gambles. He relied on systems, and systems once established were difficult to stop. American soldiers carried forward a lesson learned in the forests of Belgium. Hold fast, trust the man beside you, the system will support you. That belief transformed endurance into confidence, confidence into momentum, momentum into inevitability. German officers recognized this transformation clearly. Many later acknowledged that the Ardennes was not simply a failed offensive. It was the final test of whether psychological shock could still alter the war's trajectory. It could not. By March 1945, the Western Front no longer resembled a battlefield of maneuver, it resembled a corridor. American units crossed the Rhine not as desperate attackers, but as an army executing the final phase of a campaign already decided. German resistance continued, sometimes fiercely, but without expectation of reversal. The war had entered its closing movement. For German officer corps, the realization was quiet but absolute. They had encountered an opponent who would not collapse under pressure, who absorbed losses without losing cohesion, and who advanced with a discipline shaped by survival rather than ideology. The American soldier had not broken, and because he had not broken, nothing else could hold. That understanding would now shape the final phase of the war in the West, and how it would later be remembered. Only one final question remained. What did this endurance mean beyond victory? Shall I write the reflection now? The war in the West did not end because Germany ran out of soldiers. It ended because Germany ran out of answers. For years, German doctrine had relied on a belief as much as a strategy. The idea that enough pressure applied suddenly and violently would fracture any opponent. Shock had worked before. Speed had worked before. Fear had worked before. Against American forces, it failed. What German officers encountered on the Western Front, particularly after 1944, was not an enemy driven by fanaticism or desperation, but one sustained by structure. The American soldier did not fight as an isolated figure relying on individual brilliance. He fought inside a system that absorbed loss, replaced damage, and restores cohesion faster than pressure could destroy it. That difference mattered. When American units held under fire, it was not simply courage. It was confidence that support would come, that word would be evacuated, that ammunition would arrive, that orders would adapt to reality rather than ignore it. Endurance was not demanded, it was enabled. German commanders understood this with growing clarity. Many later acknowledged that by the final months of the war, tactical success no longer promised strategic relief. Even well-executed defenses delayed the inevitable rather than alter it. The Americans did not need dramatic breakthroughs, they needed time, and time favored the side that could endure pressure without breaking. This was the war's quiet turning point. Not a single prowl, not a single order, but a realization that the modern battlefield rewarded resilience over shock, systems over improvisation, logistics over bravado. In that environment, American soldiers proved something essential. They didn't need to be unstoppable. They only needed to remain standing. And by doing so, by refusing to collapse under fire, they denied Germany the one advantage it had relied on when all others were gone. When the war finally ended, the outcome felt sudden, but its foundation had been laid months earlier, in frozen forests, shattered villages, and foxholes that did not empty when they were supposed to. History often remembers victory in terms of movement, but sometimes, victory belongs to those who stay. And in the final year of the war in the West, that quiet strength changed everything.